On page 66 of Krugman and Wells Macroeconomics, number 8, the problem tells us that an insurance company has found, so we have a person from an insurance company goes out and looks at all their cases where they've gone out to property damage, to survey property damage after a fire, and they find that the more property damage there is, the more firefighters are on the scene. So here we have two variables. We have property damage, so amount of property damage, and we have the number of firefighters who show up to the scene. Okay. Now, part A tells us to draw a diagram that depicts this finding. Okay, and so right from the get-go, if I am told draw a diagram, typically in economics, that means set up your X and Y axes. And they want us to put the number of firefighters on the horizontal axis. And they want us to put the amount of property damage on the vertical axis, the y-axis. And they want to know, excuse me, they want to know what the argument is that's made by this diagram. And then they want us to reverse these axes and then tell us what the argument is then. So let's start with this first diagram. Well, remember that always our independent variable is going to be on the x-axis, and the dependent variable is going to be on the vertical axis or the y-axis. Now, remember that our independent variable determines the dependent variable. So in this case, we have that the number of firefighters determines the amount of property damage. Another way you could say it is that the amount of property damage depends on the number of firefighters, who show up to the scene. Now, this should not be intuitive because it's a ridiculous argument. It's saying that how much damage there is to the property depends on how many firefighters show up. So in other words, if more firefighters show up, then more property is damaged by the fire. Now that clearly doesn't make any sense. That would be like saying no, I was going to make a hospital reference, but I'm not going to do it. Let me just stay with that. It doesn't make sense to say that if more firefighters show up, then we have more property damaged by a fire. So now let's take up the second portion of this question and say, okay, well, let's switch the variables that are on the axes and then consider the argument that is made there. So let's draw these axes again, and this time, what's going on here? Oh, no, hold on a second. Okay, so let's draw these axes again, and now let's switch up what we're putting on here. So on the X now, let's put amount of property damage. And then on the Y, let's put number of firefighters. And real quick, I'm just going to erase all this so we have some room. Okay. So now let's consider what the argument that's being made here. Now again, independent variable on our X, dependent variable on our y-axis. So what this is saying now is different than what we said before. Now the amount of property damage determines the number of firefighters. I'm just going to put FF. Or another way of saying this is that the number of firefighters who show up to the scene depends on the amount of property damage. This makes more sense. It's not that, it's not you go out and you look at a property and every time you go out to a really big fire, you also see a lot of firefighters. Now, obviously, it would be incorrect to conclude that their presence is somehow causing the increased damage to this property. Rather, it's that more damage incites or justifies more firefighters coming to the scene. And so this is the argument, this second one is the argument that, squares away better with our logic and intuition. Okay. Let's see. In part B, then, it says, should the insurance company ask the city to send fewer firefighters? Well, that would be the wrong. That would be the conclusion you would make if we went with this argument here, that the amount of property damage depended on the number of firefighters, but rather, the causality here is running in the reverse direction. And so you could say that, no, the city should not, because the number of firefighters, in fact, depends on the amount of property damage rather than the other way around. That would be a perfectly acceptable answer.